Live and Let Die by Ian Fleming. Retold by John Escott. Published by Macmillan Education, a division of Macmillan Publishers Limited, 2010. Chapter 1. An Interview with M. One morning, James Bond was called to the office of his boss, M, head of the British Secret Service. Miss Moneypenny, M's private secretary, gave Bond a warm smile when he arrived. 007 is here now, sir, she said into the intercom on her desk. Send him in, came the reply. Bond knocked and walked into M's office. M was sitting behind a large leather-topped desk. A reading light made a pool of light across the desk. The rest of the room was darkened by the London fog outside the windows. Good morning, 007, said M. Sit down. Bond sat in the chair which faced M across the desk. Have you ever seen one of these? M took a gold coin from his pocket and pushed it halfway across the desk towards Bond. Bond picked it up and turned it over in his hand. No, he said. But it's worth about £500, perhaps. 1,500, said M. It's an English coin, of course, a Rose Noble of Edward IV. He took more gold coins from his pocket and dropped them on the desk in front of Bond. Spanish, French, and Dutch coins. They're worth a lot of money, just as gold, but much more to people who collect coins. If you take a look, you'll notice that they were all made before 1650. Bloody Morgan, the pirate, was governor and commander-in-chief of Jamaica from 1675 to 1688. These coins are almost certainly part of Morgan's treasure. Nearly 1,000 of them have come into the United States in the last few months, and they continue to come in, finding their way to banks and coin collectors' shops. But the FBI has a problem. If they admit that they know about the coins will stop coming into the country. They'll be melted down into gold bars and will be lost. They don't want that to happen. At the moment, someone is using a network of people who are working as porters, sleeping car attendants on trains or truck drivers, to spread the coins all across the United States. Quite innocent people, like Zachary Smith. M opened a thick file which had Top Secret written on it, and took out a single piece of paper. He began to read. Zachary Smith, 35, works as train attendant. Address 90B West 126th Street in Harlem, New York City. On the 21st of November, he sold 4 16th and 17th century gold coins to Fane Jewels in Lenox Avenue for $100. When interviewed later, Smith said they had been sold to him in a Harlem bar for $20 each. The seller was a black man he had never seen before. He told Smith that the coins were each worth $50, but Smith wanted cash immediately, so he was happy to sell them to Fane Jewels for $25 each. M put the paper back into the file. All the sales have been in Harlem or Florida. And you think they're part of Bloody Morgan's treasure, said Bond. That's almost certain because of the dates on the coins, agreed M. But Bloody Morgan's treasure is not in America. It's in Jamaica. A boat, the Secator, has been regularly sailing from a small island on the north coast of Jamaica, through the Florida Keys and into the Gulf of Mexico. This yacht sails to St. Petersburg, near Tampa, on the west coast of Florida. The FBI has discovered that the boat and the island belong to a man called Mr. Big. He's a black gangster who lives in Harlem. Have you heard about him? No, said Bond. We suspect that this Jamaican treasure is being used to get money for Russian spies in America, said M quietly. Why? We think Mr. Big is a Russian agent and a member of SMERSH. M pointed to the file in front of him. You'll find out more in here. I'd like to meet him, said Bond. I'd like to meet any member of SMERSH. M handed him the thick file. It's a joint CIA and FBI job. Be ready to start in a week. Chapter 2. New York. A pleasant-looking man met Bond at Idlewild Airport in New York. My name's Halloran, he said. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Bond. Would you follow me? Outside the airport building, a large black Buick car was waiting. Halloran and Bond climbed into it, and the driver took them towards the center of Manhattan. After a time, they stopped outside the best hotel in New York, the St. Regis, at the corner of 5th Avenue and 55th Street. A middle-aged man in a dark blue coat and a black hat came out to meet them. Halloran said, Mr. Bond, this is my boss, Captain Dexter. Can I leave him with you now, Captain? Sure, said Dexter. Ask for his bags to be sent up to room 2100, top floor. I'll go with Mr. Bond and see that he has everything he wants. Bond turned to say goodbye to Halloran. Across 55th Street was a black Chevrolet car. Bond saw it suddenly move out into the busy traffic. The driver was a black woman wearing a chauffeur's uniform. For a moment, Bond also saw the passenger in the back seat of the car. Just before the car rushed away, the huge grey-black face turned slowly and looked back at Bond through the back window. Was this the face of Mr. Big? Bond followed Captain Dexter inside the hotel and into the lift. They got out at the 21st floor and walked to room 2100. Dexter unlocked the door. The room was an expensive-looking sitting room with comfortable chairs, light grey walls, and a long sideboard. This low cupboard had several bottles of drink and glasses on it. The January sunshine shone through a wide window. At that moment, the bedroom door opened, and a tall, thin young man with blonde hair came into the room. He had a wide smile on his face. Bond stared at him in surprise. "Felix Leiter," said Bond. "What are you doing here?" He shook the other man's hand warmly. "Are you on this job?" Leiter smiled. "The CIA thought we did well on that casino job, James. So yes, here I am. I'm the link between the CIA and our friends of the FBI." He nodded his head towards Captain Dexter, who did not look especially pleased about it. "It's the FBI's case, here in America. But the CIA is interested in the Jamaican part of the job. You're here to look after the Jamaican side of things for the British. Sit down and let's have a drink. Lunch is on its way." They sat down, and Leiter gave Bond a large glass. As Bond started to drink his martini, Captain Dexter said, "Now, Mr. Bond, tell us what you know about this case." Chapter 3. A Mysterious Parcel. The morning after his arrival in New York, Bond woke up in his bedroom at the St. Regis. Dexter had given him plenty of information about Mr. Big. He was 45 years old, had been born in Haiti, and was half black and half French. The gangster had got his name because of his large size, and because of the initials of his full name. Buonaparte Ignacy Gallia, B.I.G. After moving to America, he had various different jobs. Then he was forced to join the American Armed Forces during the Second World War. Because of his excellent French, he worked for the American Secret Service in France, where he worked closely with a Russian spy who was doing a similar job. After the war, he disappeared for 5 years, probably to Moscow. He returned to Harlem in 1950 and bought several nightclubs. The FBI suspected that he was working as a Russian spy, but they could never be totally sure. He soon became a man to fear. People who went against him were murdered or mysteriously disappeared, never to be seen again. Those who did not listen to his instructions had their homes burnt down or their families threatened. Naturally, all this helped to make Mr. Big a very powerful man. Very soon, he had large criminal organizations working for him, with his own spies everywhere. They were all ready at a moment's notice to report back to him what they had seen. Bond had questioned Dexter and Leiter very closely about Mr. Big's connections to Smersh. He was now almost certain that Mr. Big was a member. But the porters, the truck drivers, and all the other men who passed on information to him had no idea that they were giving it to a Russian spy. Fear of death and cruelty was enough to stop them asking questions. Bond picked up the telephone and asked for breakfast to be sent to his room. Then he collected the newspapers and parcels that had been put quietly on his hall table earlier that morning. Yesterday afternoon, a man had come and measured him for 2 dark blue suits. Another man had brought some uncomfortable white shirts with long points to the collars. He had also had to accept 6 unusually bright and patterned ties, some dark socks with large patterns on them, a plain grey hat, and 2 pairs of handmade black casual shoes. To hold all of these things, there was a lightweight American suitcase. He was allowed to keep his own Beretta 25 gun and shoulder holster. His other things were going to be collected at midday. They would be sent on to Jamaica to wait for him. It was all part of the Americanization of Bond, ordered by the FBI. His dark hair was now shorter, and he had been told that he was from Boston, New England, and was visiting New York during his holidays. He had been reminded to ask for the check rather than the bill in restaurants, and to say cab instead of taxi. Bond had a shower and dressed. Later, in a white shirt and blue trousers, he opened the door for the waiter. The man brought in Bond's breakfast, together with a brown parcel about a foot square. Bond told the waiter to put the parcel on the sideboard. Something else from Leiter, he guessed. It was only after he had finished eating that he heard the very soft ticking noise. It was coming from the sideboard. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Bond immediately dived to the floor behind an armchair. He waited nervously. Crack! The parcel exploded and fell to the floor. Bond looked over the back of the armchair. The glasses and bottles on the sideboard were broken, and there was a black mark from smoke on the wall behind them. He got up slowly and went straight to the window and opened it. Then he picked up the phone and called Dexter. Soon after, there was a knock on the door. "Who is it?" Bond called. "Dexter." Dexter came in, followed by a young man with a black box under his arm. The young man at once went down on his knees beside what was left of the parcel. He opened his box and put on some special gloves to protect his hands. Then he began to collect small bits of metal and glass from the carpet. Also lying on the carpet was a small metal tube. From it, the young man took out a piece of paper. Bond and Dexter read it. "The heart of the clock has stopped ticking," The beats of your heart are numbered. I know that number, and I have started to count. The message was signed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Mr. Big, said Bond. But how did he know you were here? Asked Dexter. Bond told him about the black Chevrolet car outside the hotel. But the point is, said Bond, how did he know what I was here for? It shows he's got spies everywhere, including in Washington and in the CIA. Chapter 4. The Whisper. Bond spent the morning on Fifth Avenue and on Broadway, looking in shop windows and watching the passing crowds. He had lunch at a restaurant on Lexington Avenue, then took a taxi to the police headquarters in the center of New York. He had arranged to meet Leiter and Dexter there at 2:30. A Lieutenant Binswanger of Homicide showed them Mr. Big's police record and the reports about the Secretary yacht. The boat had often sailed into St. Petersburg over the last 6 months. It always stopped at the jetty of the Ouroboros worm and bait shippers, a company whose main business was to sell live bait to fishing clubs in Florida and the Gulf of Mexico. It also sold seashells, coral, and aquarium fish. According to the manager of Ouroboros, the Secretary did big business with his company and brought in shells and tropical fish from Jamaica. These were bought and then stored in the Ouroboros warehouse. Later, the shells and fish were sold to shops up and down the coast. As they were leaving his office, Lieutenant Binswanger said, "More gold has been coming in recently. About 100 coins a week in Harlem and New York alone. Do you want us to do anything about it?" "The boss says not yet," Dexter told him. When Bond, Dexter, and Leiter were out on the pavement, Dexter said, "I had some instructions from Washington this morning. I've got to look after the Harlem side of the case, and you two have been asked to go down to St. Petersburg tomorrow. Leiter's got to find out what he can there, then move on to Jamaica with you, Mr. Bond. Is there anything else I can do for you? If you don't mind, Leiter and I would like to go to Harlem this evening and have a look round," said Bond. Dexter thought for a moment. "Okay," he said, "but don't get hurt. There's no one to help you up there. And don't make trouble for us with Mr. Big. Until we're ready to get him, we say, live and let live." Bond smiled. "In my job, when I meet a man like Mr. Big, I have another saying. It's live and let die." "Maybe," said Dexter. "But you take my orders while you're here, Mr. Bond." He waved his hand to stop a passing taxi. The yellow car stopped. Dexter got in, and then Bond and Leiter watched the car drive away. "Well, what about going to Harlem tonight, Felix?" asked Bond. "Sure," said Leiter. "I'll meet you in the King Cole bar of the St. Regis at 6:30. Up in Harlem, at the big telephone switchboard, the Whisper was half asleep. All his telephone lines were quiet. Suddenly, a light shone on the board, an important light.
"Yes, boss,"
he said softly into his headset.
"Tell all spies to watch for 3 men,"
said a slow, deep voice. A description of Leiter, Bond, and Dexter followed.
"They may be coming in this evening or tomorrow. Tell them to watch carefully on 1st to 8th, on the other avenues. The nightclubs, too. Call me when you know where they are."
"Yes, boss," said the Whisper, breathing fast. Soon after, He was whispering quickly and softly late into the evening. At 6 o'clock, Bond had a cold shower and dressed carefully. He wore a white shirt and put his leather shoulder holster on top of it. Next, he put his Beretta into the holster. He looked at the casual shoes the FBI had given him. Then, he reached under the bed and pulled out a pair of his own shoes and put them on. Under the leather, the toe caps were made of steel. At 6:25, he went down to the King Cole bar. A few minutes later, Felix Leiter came in and sat down. His head of yellow hair was now coloured black, and he wore a bright blue suit with a white shirt and a black and white spotted tie. "Mr. Big's people may have my description," Leiter said, and gave Bond a big smile. "We'll catch a bus on 5th Avenue. You won't find many cabs that want to go to Harlem after it's dark." Chapter 5. Harlem. 3 men waited at the bus stop on the corner of 5th Avenue and Cathedral Parkway. They were wet and bored. They had been watching the traffic on 5th Avenue since 4:30, but now a bus stopped and one of the men got on it. He saw the 2 white men and sat down on a seat behind them. He had been given descriptions, and he recognized Bond, but not the other man. At the next stop, he got off the bus and hurried to the nearest public phone. The whisper questioned him urgently, then immediately started to pass on the information. "Boss, the Englishman is on a bus on 5th Avenue. He's got a friend with him, but the friend doesn't seem to match the description of either of the other 2. The whisper then described Leiter. "They're both coming north."
Warn the clubs and get this information to T.H. Johnson, McThing, Blabbermouth Foley, Sam Miami, said the voice at the other end of the line. It spoke for another 5 minutes. After that, the whisper began giving out the news. From the moment Bond and Leiter walked into Sugar Ray's club on 7th Avenue, there was a team of men and women watching them, or waiting to watch them. These men and women reported what they saw to the whisper. The famous nightclub was crowded, and the walls were covered with pictures of Sugar Ray Robinson, the famous boxer. Bond and Leiter found an empty table, sat down and ordered drinks. As Bond was paying the waiter, Leiter said suddenly, "Do you know where Mr. Big is tonight?" The waiter's eyes opened wide. He moved close to Leiter. "I got a wife and kids, sir,"
he said out of the corner of his mouth.
"Don't ask me that."
Then he hurried away. "Mr. Big's got the best protection of all," said Leiter. "Fear." They finished their drinks and went out onto 7th Avenue. The rain had stopped, but there was an icy cold wind. They moved along with the other people on the pavement, but the looks they were given were not friendly. The streets were dirty, and many of the buildings were dark and unwelcoming. Bond wondered what secrets were held behind some of the closed doors. "We'll go to Mar Frazier's, further up the avenue," said Leiter. "It has the best food in Harlem." They had an excellent meal, a fried chicken Maryland with bacon and sweet corn. But when Leiter asked the waiter about Mr. Big, the man pretended not to hear. When they had finished eating and Bond was paying the bill, Leiter tried again.
"Sorry, sir," said the waiter. "I don't remember anyone with that name."
By the time they left the restaurant, it was 10:30. They took a taxi to the Savoy Ballroom, where they had drinks and watched the dancers in the huge, crowded hall. Bond thought many of the girls were very beautiful, and he found the music exciting. He almost forgot what he was there for. "Great, isn't it?" said Leiter. "But we'd better move on. I'll have a walk around while you pay for the drinks. I'll see if I can get any information about where Mr. Big is. We don't want to have to go to all his places." They met outside the entrance a few minutes later, then walked up the street looking for a taxi. "It cost me $20, said Leiter, "but I was told he'll be at the Boneyard on Lenox Avenue soon after midnight. I'll take you to the Yeah Man Club on 7th Avenue first. Then we'll move on to the Boneyard at about 12:30. There's a girl dancer there called Gigi Sumatra. I'm sure you'll like her very much, James." The big switchboard was almost quiet. The two men had been checked in and out of Sugar Ray's, Ma Fraser's, the Savoy Ballroom, and Yeah Man. The last call came at 12:30, as Bond and Leiter were on their way to the Boneyard. Mr. Big spoke on the phone to the head waiter of the Boneyard.
"Two white men are coming in. Give them table Z."
He made two more phone calls. One was to the MC, the master of ceremonies, the man introducing the entertainment.
"Put the lights out at the end of Gigi's act," he said.
"Yes, sir, boss," said the MC. The other call was to four men who were playing cards in a downstairs room. It was a long call, and the instructions were carefully explained and very detailed. At 12:45, Bond and Leiter paid their taxi driver and walked into the Boneyard. The head waiter met them and took them to a table in the corner of the club, by the small, crowded dance floor. Bond looked round. It was not a large room, but there were about 50 tables, and about 200 people. The music stopped. The four-man band carried their musical instruments away, and the red light under the glass dance floor was turned off. Instead, pencil-thin lights in the roof came on and shone on coloured glass balls that hung around the walls, yellow, blue, and red. There were calls of, "Where's Gigi?" and "Come on, Gigi!" from the crowd. Suddenly, the MC came out onto the dance floor. A single white light shone down on him. As the rest of the room went dark, there was silence.
"Folks, it's time,"
he said, smiling. He put out his right hand.
"Mr. Jungles, Jafford, and his drums."
Another light came on, and the crowd clapped excitedly. Across the floor, four smiling black men in red shirts and white trousers sat behind four drums of different sizes.
"And now, friends," said the MC, "Gigi Sumatra!"
The last word was a shout. Two huge black men ran out onto the dance floor. They were carrying a young woman. She was wearing a long black coat and had a black mask across her eyes. The men put her down in the middle of the floor, then moved away into the darkness. The crowd was suddenly silent. The four men started to play the drums, slowly and loudly. The girl began to dance, slowly at first, and then a little faster. She put her hand up to her neck, and the coat fell away from her. Now she was wearing a small black dress. Her body was small, brown, and beautiful. The drums beat faster. She moved faster with them, turning round and round. The drums beat louder. She picked up the coat and threw it off the dance floor. Some minutes later, the lights suddenly went out. The room was in total darkness, and the crowd started shouting. Bond felt cold air on his face. At the same time, he realized that the shouts from the crowd were disappearing. "Hey!" shouted Leiter. His voice was close, but sounded strange. Then something closed above Bond's head. He put his hand behind him, and it touched a moving wall. "Lights," said a voice quietly. Both of Bond's arms were being held tightly, and he was pushed down in his chair. Leiter still sat opposite him across the same table, Table Z, but with a huge man holding his arms. They were in the small room downstairs. To their right and left were two more men, each one holding a gun. One of the men put his gun against Bond's stomach. Then he moved his free hand across Bond until he found Bond's beretta. He took it and gave it to the other man with the gun.
"Give that to the boss, Teehee," he said. "Take the Englishman up. His guard will go with you. His friend will stay with me." "Yes, sir," said the man called Teehee.
He was fat and wore a chocolate-coloured shirt. Bond was pulled up onto his feet. He had one foot under a leg of the table, and he pulled it hard. There was a crash of glass. At the same moment, Leiter kicked backwards behind his chair. His foot hit his guard's leg. Bond did the same, but missed. Then Leiter's guard threw him against the wall so hard that Leiter's nose was almost smashed. When he turned round, blood was pouring out of it. The man giving the orders spoke to Bond's guard. "Take him away. Mr. Big's waiting." He turned to Bond. "Say goodbye to your friend. You probably won't see each other again." Bond smiled at Leiter. "See you later," he said. Bond's guard turned him round and pushed him against part of the wall. A door opened suddenly, and the man called Teehee pushed past them. "This way," he said, and then the door closed behind. Chapter 6. Mr. Big. Bond was taken through several doors to a large warehouse by his guard and Teehee. They walked across the warehouse floor to a metal door, and Teehee rang a bell. After a moment, the door opened. A man with a gun stepped back, and they went through into a hallway. "You can go in, Teehee," said the man with the gun. Teehee knocked on a door in front of them, opened it, and then took Bond into the room. Mr. Big sat behind an expensive desk, his huge head resting against the back of his chair. It was a great football of a head, twice the normal size and very nearly round. There were no hairs on the head, and the skin was grey-black. The face was like the face of a week-old dead man. There was nothing on the desk except an intercom with about 20 buttons, and a very small riding whip. Bond's guard led him across the thick carpet to a low chair. Bond sat down and faced the man across the desk. Mr. Big looked at him. There was one high window above his head, and all of the other walls were covered with bookshelves. Bond could not see a door. Mr. Big spoke. "Stay, Teehee," he said. His eyes moved to the other man. "You can go, Miami." "Yes, sir, boss," they both said. Bond heard a door open and close. He put a hand to his pocket to find his cigarettes. Mr. Big spoke. "You can smoke, Mr. Bond. Do not try to do anything else. I hear that you have a 00 number. 007. Which means you have had to kill a man. Have you been sent over here to kill me?" So, Moscow sent him my description, Bond thought. "Mr. Bond, you must answer me if you and your friend want to stay alive," said Mr. Big. "And don't try to lie to me. I shall know if you do." Bond answered carefully. "English gold coins have been bought and sold in America. Edward IV rose nobles," he said. "Some have been sold in Harlem. The American government asked for help to discover where they're coming from. I came to Harlem to investigate. I came with a man from the American Treasury. who I hope is now safely on his way back to his hotel.
Mr. Leiter is an agent for the CIA, not the Treasury,
said Mr. Big.
He is in a very dangerous situation at the moment.
He thought for a moment, then said,
T. Tie Mr. Bond to his chair.
Bond started to get up from his seat.
Don't move, Mr. Bond,
said Mr. Big,
unless you want to be shot.
Bond sat down again. Immediately a belt was passed round his body. 2 belts went round his wrists and were tied to the arms of the chair. Then 2 more were tied round his legs. Mr. Big pushed down a button on the intercom.
Send in Miss Solitaire.
Part of a bookcase to the right of the desk opened, and a very beautiful woman came in. The woman looked over Bond, inch by inch, from his head to his feet. She turned to Mr. Big. "Yes?" she asked simply. Mr. Big did not move his head. He spoke to Bond.
This is a very clever woman, Mr. Bond,
he said.
She is telepathic. She knows at once when someone is not telling the truth.
He turned and looked at her coldly.
I'm going to marry her because she is so special. But at the moment, she will have nothing to do with men. That is why, in Haiti, where she comes from, she was called Solitaire. Sit down, he said quietly to her. Tell me if this man lies.
The woman got a chair and sat down near Bond. Her blue eyes looked into his, and they seemed to have some sort of message for him. She was wearing a long white evening dress, which showed the shape of her beautiful body. She had diamond earrings and a diamond bracelet on her left wrist, but no rings on her fingers. As he watched her, she leaned forward, her knee almost touching his. The silent message was clear, and a warm smile must have appeared on Bond's face. Suddenly, Mr. Big picked up the riding whip from the desk and hit the girl cruelly across her shoulders.
Sit up,
he said. She sat up slowly. She had a pack of playing cards in her hands, and used them to send Bond another silent message. She opened the pack so that the Knave of Hearts was opposite the Queen of Spades. Then she brought the 2 halves of the pack together so that the 2 cards kissed. At no time did she look at Bond, but now he was sure that he had a friend.
Are you ready, Solitaire?
Asked Mr. Big. Yes, the cards are ready, she said.
Mr. Bond, look into the eyes of this woman and tell me again the reason you are here.
Bond looked into her eyes and repeated what he had said earlier. Did the woman know that he was not telling the whole truth? If she did, would she speak for him or against him? For a moment there was silence. She looked at Mr. Big. He speaks the truth, she said coldly. Chapter 7. Death on the Stairs. Mr. Big thought for a moment, then pushed a button on the intercom on his desk.
Blabbermouth, you're holding the American Leiter, he said. Hurt him. Then take him to Bellevue Hospital and leave him outside. Don't let anyone see you. Yes, sir, boss, came the reply. Damn you, said Bond.
Mr. Big looked at Bond, then at Teehee.
Teehee, break the little finger of Mr. Bond's left hand.
Teehee laughed and walked across to Bond. Bond held on tightly to the arms of his chair. He started to sweat, and tried to imagine the pain so that he could control it. Teehee took hold of the little finger of Bond's left hand and started to bend it back. The sweat poured off Bond's face as he fought the pain. Suddenly, there was a terrible crack as the finger broke, and Bond fainted. Solitaire closed her eyes.
"Did he have a gun?"
asked Mr. Big.
"Yes, sir, boss,"
said Teehee. He took the Beretta from his pocket and put it on the desk. Mr. Big picked it up and emptied the bullets onto his desk. Then he pushed the gun towards its owner.
"Wake him up,"
he said. He looked at his watch. It said 3 o'clock. Teehee pushed his fingernails into Bond's neck. Bond's eyes opened, and he lifted his head. He looked at Mr. Big and swore at him.
"Be glad that you're not dead,"
Mr. Big told him.
"Teehee, give him his gun. I have the bullets."
Teehee took it off the desk and put the Beretta into Bond's shoulder holster.
"So, why are you still alive, Mr. Bond?"
said Mr. Big.
"Why aren't you at the bottom of the Harlem River? I'll tell you. Because it would be a nuisance for me to have a lot of people asking questions about the disappearance of yourself and Mr. Leiter. I have more important things to worry me at this time."
He looked at his watch.
"So you must leave the country today. And Mr. Leiter must move on to another job. If I see you again, you'll die. Teehee, take Mr. Bond to the garage. Tell 2 men to take him to Central Park and leave him there."
Teehee took the belts from Bond's wrists and legs. Next, he took Bond's injured left hand and pushed it up behind his back. Then he took off the belt around Bond's body and pulled him to his feet. Solitaire was staring at her hands. She did not look up. Teehee pushed Bond forward towards a bookcase. He reached across and put a hand on one of the books, and a large part of the bookcase opened like a door. He pushed Bond through and closed the bookcase behind him. They walked down a short corridor towards some stairs. When they were near the top of the stairs, Bond stopped suddenly. Teehee's body fell against him, and Bond quickly turned and used his right hand to hit the other man hard in the stomach. Teehee screamed and dropped Bond's left arm. Bond pulled his empty gun from its holster and hit Teehee across the head. He fell onto his knees, and Bond kicked him with his steel-capped shoe. Teehee screamed again as he fell down the stairs. Bond wiped the sweat from his face and listened. He pushed his left hand into his coat. The pain was terrible, and the hand was twice its usual size. Holding his gun in his right hand, he walked slowly and quietly down the stairs. At the bottom, Teehee was lying on his back. He was either dead or dying from a broken neck. Bond checked the body for a gun and found a Colt .38 Detective Special. He took it and put his Beretta back in his shoulder holster. There was a small door in front of him. He put his ear against it and heard the sound of an engine. It had to be the garage where they were waiting for him and Teehee. Bond pushed the door open with a crash. A black car with its engine running was waiting. He saw 2 black men, one sitting in the driver's seat of the car and the other standing next to the passenger door. There were several other cars, but nobody else. Bond shot the man near the passenger door in the stomach, then quickly turned towards the driver of the car. The man screamed, and Bond shot him through the head. Bond ran round the car and opened the door. The driver's body fell towards him, and he pulled it out onto the ground. He climbed into the driver's seat and shut the door. There was a shot as he drove out of the garage. The bullet hit the side of the car. Bond guessed that the first man was still alive and had managed to reach his gun. Outside the garage, the street was dark and empty. At the end of the street, Bond came to some red traffic lights. He drove through them. There were several more dark streets before he came to an avenue with streetlights. There was traffic now. Further on, he checked the street signs and saw that he was on the corner of Park Avenue and 116th Street. He slowed again at the next street. It was 115th. He was going away from Harlem and back into the city. He turned into 60th Street, stopped the car, and got out. He took the gun off the passenger seat and pushed it into his belt. Then he walked back to Park Avenue. A few minutes later, he stopped a taxi. Back at the St. Regis Hotel, the man at the desk had a message for him. Bond opened the envelope with his right hand. It was from Felix. Sent at 4 a.m. Call me at once. Chapter 8. A Strange Report to M. In his hotel room, Bond poured himself a whiskey and then used the telephone. Leiter answered at once.
Thank God you're alive, he said. Are you hurt?
Broken finger, said Bond. What about you?
Nothing serious. Blabbermouth and I got quite friendly. I got him talking about movies and music until instructions came from Mr. Big. Then he said, "Sorry, mister," knocked me out and took me to Bellevue Hospital. He left me outside. I went to the emergency room where they looked at my head. Then I came home. I got telephone calls from the police and the FBI. Mr. Big had complained that a crazy Englishman had shot 3 of his men early this morning. A waiter at the boneyard and 2 drivers, and had stolen one of his cars. Mr. Big wants the police to do something about it, but I talked to them and the FBI. They're not going to chase after us, but they're very angry, and we've both got to get out of New York at once. Also, Mr. Big will be coming after you, James. Now, tell me exactly what happened to you. Bond told his story. When he had finished, Leiter said, "That solitaire lady certainly seems to be your friend. We need to make plans. Listen, I'll phone you again in a few minutes. First, I'll get the police doctor to come and see you. While you're waiting, you'd better call your boss in London." 10 minutes later, Bond was speaking to M. He chose his words carefully. He knew that someone might be listening to the conversation. "It's James, sir," he said. "I may need a bit of help. I went across town to see our main customer last night. 3 of his best men became sick while I was there." How sick?
asked M. "As sick as a person can be," answered Bond.
Did you get sick?
"Only a little, sir," said Bond. "But Federated thinks I'll feel better away from town." Bond smiled. M would know that Federated was the FBI. "So Felicia and I are going soon."
Who?
asked M. "Felicia." Bond spelt the name. "You know, my new secretary from Washington."
Oh, yes,
said M. "I thought I'd try that factory at San Pedro," said Bond. "But Federate may have other ideas. I hope you can help me."
Yes, of course, replied. Anything else?
"No, that's all, sir." "Sir?" said Bond. "Thank you." Bond put down the telephone and grinned. He could imagine M explaining the news to the Chief of Staff.
007's already upset the FBI, he would say. The fool went up to Harlem and killed 3 of Mr. Big's men. He got hurt himself, but only a little. He's got to get out of New York with Leiter, the CIA man. They're going down to St. Petersburg. Washington will be complaining to us in a minute. Apologize, and tell them that it won't happen. Bond's telephone rang. It was Leiter again. "Everyone's calmer now," he told Bond. "The 3 men you killed were T.E. Johnson, Sam Miami, and a man called McThing. The police wanted all of them for different crimes. The FBI wants you to be sent home, so we'd better get out of town quickly. We can't go together, so you're going on the train and I'll fly. Write this down." Bond reached for some paper and a pencil. "Pennsylvania Station, track 14, Leiter told him. 10:30 this morning. The Silver Phantom. It goes to St. Petersburg through Washington, Jacksonville, and Tampa. Pullman car 245, compartment H. The ticket will be on the train in the name of Bryce. The conductor will have it. Go straight to your compartment and lock yourself inside until the train starts moving. The train gets to St. Petersburg at midday tomorrow. Get a cab to the Everglades Cannabis, Gulf Boulevard West, on Sunset Beach. That's on Treasure Island, where all the beach hotels are. It's an island joined to St. Petersburg by a causeway. Be careful. Mr. Big will be looking for you. Any questions?" "It sounds fine," said Bond. "Look after yourself, Felix. See you tomorrow." The police doctor came and stayed for a painful 15 minutes. When he had gone, Bond was thinking of ordering breakfast when the phone rang. He picked it up. A woman's voice asked for Mr. Bond. "Who's calling?" asked Bond. He knew the answer. "I know it's you," said the voice. "This is Solitaire. Listen. I've got to be quick. You must trust me. I've got to get away, and so must you. You've got to take me. I can't help you. I know a lot of his secrets. But be quick. If he finds out I called you, he'll kill me. Please, you must trust me." Bond said nothing for a moment. He was thinking fast. Then he said, "Okay, write this down. Be at Pennsylvania Station at 10:20 exactly. The Silver Phantom to Washington. Pullman car 245, compartment H. Say that you're Mrs. Bryce. The conductor will have the ticket if I'm not already there. Go straight to the compartment and wait for me." "Thank you. Thank you," said Solitaire. "Now I must go." Bond put down the telephone. "That's going to make things interesting," he said to himself, smiling. At the big switchboard in Harlem, the Whisper was giving Bond's description to all spies. "Watch the hotel. Watch all the airports. All the train stations."
Chapter 9. The Silver Phantom. Bond left the hotel through a back door and got a taxi to Pennsylvania Station. One of Mr. Big's spies saw him when he got out of the taxi. The man hurried to a telephone. Some minutes later, a waiter in the train's dining car was replaced by another man. This man had been given full and careful instructions on the telephone. The Silver Phantom was a long train of silver carriages. It stood quietly in the half-light of the underground station. There were not many passengers. More would get on at Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. Pullman car 245 was near the back of the train. A porter stood at the door. His black face was bored but friendly. "Compartment H," said Bond.
Mr. Bryce? Said the porter. Mrs. Bryce has just arrived. Go to the end of the carriage.
Bond stepped onto the train. A notice said, "If you need anything, ring for your Pullman porter, Samuel D. Baldwin." Compartment H was more than halfway down the carriage. There was an American couple in Compartment E, but all the other rooms were empty. The door of Compartment H was locked. Bond knocked. "Who's that?" asked a woman's voice nervously. "It's me," said Bond. The door opened. Bond walked through and locked the door behind him. Solitaire wore a black suit and her eyes were wide with fear. She looked beautiful. "Thank God," she said. Bond looked round the room. Then he opened the bathroom door and looked in. It was empty. Moments later, the train began to move. He sat down on a seat with his back to the engine. Solitaire sat down opposite him, and he saw the dark skin under her eyes. "She hasn't slept either," thought Bond. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. "I'm glad I did," said Bond. He was trying to open a new pack of cigarettes with his right hand. She reached over, took the pack, and opened it for him. "You're going to be busy," he said, smiling. "I smoke 3 packs a day." "I'll just help with the new packs until we get to St. Petersburg," she said. Bond's smile disappeared, and his eyes narrowed. "What's wrong?" she said. "Oh, I knew we were going further than Washington. Mr. Big was certain you'd travel to Florida. I heard him warning his people down there about you. He spoke to a man called the Robber. He told him to watch the airport at Tampa and the trains. Perhaps we should get off the train earlier, at one of the small stations up the coast." "Did they see you get on the train?" "I don't think so," said Bond. He was calm again. "Did you have any trouble getting away?" "It was my day for a singing lesson," she said. "Mr. Big wants me to be a singer at the boneyard. One of his men took me to my teacher, and he'll be there to collect me at midday." She looked at her watch. "They'll be looking for me in about an hour. I waited until the car had gone, then telephoned you. Next, I got a cab and went into the city. I bought a toothbrush and a few other things. All I've got with me is my jewelry and about $5,000 of my own money." She looked out of the window. "I've been locked up with Mr. Big and his gangsters for such a long time. It feels wonderful to be away from them." "You saved my life last night. Are you really telepathic?" "Yes," she said. "I can often see what's going to happen, especially to other people. In Haiti, I did it for entertainment, and I was paid." She smiled at him. "When I first saw you, I knew you were going to help me. But it's going to be difficult and dangerous." He looked at her for several moments. "I can tell you want to know more about me," she said. "But there's nothing very bad to know. My real name is Simone Luttrell, and I'm 25 years old. I'll tell you all about me when we have time. But I want to forget about the past, and now I'm happy. But I'm hungry and very sleepy. Which bed will you have?" "I think I'd better have the bottom one," replied Bond. Lunch arrived, brought by a black waiter. He seemed to be in a hurry to be paid and get back to his work. When they had finished eating, Bond rang for the train attendant, and the man started to get their beds ready. He seemed worried about something, and he pretended to find it difficult to move around in the small compartment. At last he said, "Perhaps Mrs. Bryce would like to go to the next room while I finish this? It's empty all the way to St. Petersburg." He unlocked the inside door to the next compartment without waiting for an answer. Bond nodded to Solitaire, and she went through the door. Bond remembered the porter's name and said, "Is there something you want to tell me, Baldwin?"
"Yes, sir, Mr. Bryce," said the attendant nervously. "You've got an enemy on this train. I've heard things I don't like. There's a man who's very interested in you, and he's a bad man. Very bad. You need to be careful."
He took 2 small pieces of wood from his pocket.
"Push these under the doors to stop them opening."
"But—" Bond began.
"Can't help you any more, sir," said Baldwin. "I'll bring your dinner later. Don't let anybody else into the room."
He went out quickly. Bond opened the inside door. "He's finished," he told Solitaire. She came back into the compartment and climbed up onto the top bed. The room was almost in darkness, with just a small light on by the bottom bed. Bond pushed the pieces of wood carefully under both doors. Then he took his coat off, lay down on his bed, and went to sleep. A few carriages away, a black waiter was waiting for the 10-minute stop at Philadelphia. He had a message that he needed to send. Chapter 10. A Visitor in the Night. The train travelled on through the bright afternoon. They left Pennsylvania behind, and Maryland. They stopped at Washington, then went on into Virginia. Bond woke up at 7 o'clock. They had dinner, and at 9 o'clock Baldwin came to take the dishes away. "What time do we get into Jacksonville?" Bond asked him.
"About 5 o'clock in the morning, sir," said Baldwin.
"Is there a subway at the station?" asked Bond.
"Yes, sir. This carriage stops next to it," replied Baldwin.
"Can you have the door open and the steps down quickly?" said Bond. Baldwin smiled.
"Yes, sir. I can do that,"
he said. Bond gave him $10. After the attendant had left, Bond put the pieces of wood back under the doors. He told Solitaire of the warning Baldwin had given him earlier. "I'm not surprised," she said. "They probably saw you coming into the station. Mr. Big's got a team of spies everywhere. There will be one of them on the train, an attendant or a waiter, or someone else in the dining car. He can make these people do anything he wants them to do." "Is it true that he's a member of SMERSH, the Russian spy organization?" asked Bond. "I don't know what SMERSH is," said Solitaire. "But I know he works for Russia. I've heard him talking to Russian visitors. And if Moscow is using him, they are using one of the most powerful men in America. He can find out anything, and if he doesn't get what he wants, somebody is usually killed." "So I've heard," said Bond. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. "We need to get as much sleep as we can," he said. "We'll get off the train at Jacksonville and find another way down to the coast. Maybe his spies won't see us." Suddenly, Solitaire put her arms around his neck and kissed him. "I always hoped that I would meet someone like you," she said quietly. Bond smiled at her. "I think we need to get some sleep. We'll have to wake up at 4 o'clock, he said. Then he quietly pulled the piece of wood away from under the door that opened into the next compartment. He turned the lock. He took the Beretta out of its holster, then looked at Solitaire and nodded his head towards the door. She understood and opened it quickly. The next compartment was empty. "Call me when you're ready for bed," he said. And he went in and closed the door behind him. The door to the corridor was locked. The compartment was the same as theirs, but Bond checked it carefully. If anyone came in, it would be through the doors. He would just have to stay awake. Solitaire called for him. When he went back into their compartment, she was already lying down in the top bed. "Try and get some sleep," said Bond. He checked the pieces of wood under the doors, then took off his tie and lay down on the bottom bed. He lay thinking about Solitaire and listening to the sound of the train. Soon it was 11 o'clock, and they were travelling between Columbia and Savannah, Georgia. It would be another 6 hours before they were in Jacksonville. Mr. Big had probably told his man on the train to try to kill Bond during the night, while everyone was asleep and the corridors were empty. Bond read for a while, then turned off his light and thought about Solitaire and the future. He was half asleep when he heard someone trying to unlock the door of their compartment. It was 1 o'clock. Moving silently, he went to the inside door and pulled the piece of wood from under it. He opened the door and went into the next compartment. There was a loud click as he unlocked the door to the corridor. He quickly pulled it open and jumped into the corridor. Bond saw a man running fast towards the end of the carriage, but he could not get his gun out quickly enough to shoot. Because of his painful hand, he had had to push his Beretta into his belt to open the compartment door. The man had gone, and Bond did not chase him. There were too many empty compartments for the man to hide in. He went back, carefully closing and locking the doors. He lay down again and waited for the night to end. Chapter 11. The Everglades. It was 5 o'clock in the morning when Bond and Solitaire got off the train at Jacksonville. It was still dark, and there were very few lights on in the station. The entrance to the subway was near car 245, and there was nobody around when they ran down the steps. Bond had told Baldwin to keep the door of their compartment locked after they had left. With luck, no one would know they had gone until the train reached St. Petersburg. Bond checked and found that the next train to St. Petersburg was the Silver Meteor. It would leave Jacksonville at 9 o'clock that morning. He and Solitaire walked out into the warm, dark street and found an all-night restaurant. They had breakfast and talked. Solitaire told Bond that she had been living in an apartment in Mr. Big's Harlem apartment building. "I've been like a prisoner there for the last 2 years," she said. "2 women live in the apartment with me, and he never lets me go out without a guard. Sometimes I have to go to the room where I saw you and tell him if someone is lying to him. If they are, he usually kills them." Bond listened carefully. Every detail she told him added to the picture of a very powerful and cruel man, with a huge team of people working for him. "Do you know anything about the gold coins?" he asked. "I've had to ask men how many they've sold and the price they've got for them," she said. "Very often they lie about both." Bond was careful to say very little of what he knew or guessed. He had strong feelings for Solitaire, but Bond was there to do his job, and his feelings for her would not change that. The Silver Meteor arrived at 9 o'clock and took them down through Florida. They had lunch, then left the train at Clearwater, which was the last station before St. Petersburg. Bond stopped a taxi and gave the driver the address on Treasure Island. It was 2 o'clock, and the hot sun burnt down out of a blue sky. The taxi stopped in traffic just before the long Treasure Island causeway across the waters of Boca Ciega Bay. A large man was driving a taxi next to them. When he saw Solitaire, his mouth fell open in surprise. He stopped the taxi soon after and ran to a public telephone.
"Let me talk to the robber,"
he said a few moments later.
"Robber? Listen, Mr. Big must be in town. I just saw his girl in a Clearwater cab."
"What? You just talked to him in New York?"
"Well, it was her. She was with a man in a blue suit." "Follow him." "Okay. I'll stop their cab when it comes back across the causeway." Okay. 5 minutes later, the man called the robber was speaking to Mr. Big in New York. He had been warned about Bond, but Solitaire was a surprise. He listened to the instructions from Mr. Big, then thought for a moment. $10,000 to do the job. He would need 2 men, so that would leave $8,000 for him. He smiled, then picked up the telephone again. Bond and Solitaire got out of the taxi at a group of small white and yellow beach houses, called the Everglades. These were on 3 sides of a square of grass, which went down to a beach and the sea. The 2 of them went through a door with the word office on it. The woman behind the desk had blue-grey hair. She smiled. "Yes?" "Mr. Leiter," said Bond.
"Oh, yes," she said. "You're Mr. Bryce. I'll show you to your cottage. Number 1, right down by the sea. Mr. Leiter's been waiting for you."
She looked at Solitaire. "This is Mrs. Bryce," said Bond.
"Oh,"
said the woman.
"I'm Mrs. Stuyvesant."
She took them down a path to a cottage and knocked on the door. Leiter opened it. His mouth fell open in surprise when he saw Bond. "This is my wife," Bond said quickly.
"Oh, yes. Hello,"
said Leiter. He almost pulled the 2 of them into the cottage, then shut the door before Mrs. Stuyvesant could speak. A small living room looked across the beach to the sea. It had comfortable beach chairs and a large table with a glass top. There was a white telephone and some flowers on the table. Bond and Solitaire sat down, and Bond lit a cigarette. He put the pack on the table. Leiter was still staring at them, his eyes wide with surprise, unable to speak. Suddenly, the telephone rang and Leiter picked it up.
"Is that you, Lieutenant?"
he said.
"Yes. He's here. He's just arrived."
He listened for a moment, and then turned to Bond.
"Where did you leave the train?"
Bond told him.
"Jacksonville,"
Leiter said into the phone.
"Yes.
I'll get the information from him and phone you later." He put down the telephone and sat down opposite Bond. He looked at Solitaire. "I guess you're Solitaire," he said, and smiled at her. "She's working with us now," Bond told him. "That's great," said Leiter. "Well, you won't have seen the newspapers or heard the radio, so I'll tell you. The Phantom was stopped soon after Jacksonville. Your compartment was bombed, and the bomb killed the train attendant. He was outside in the corridor. The police started asking questions immediately. Who did it? Who are Mr. and Mrs. Bryce? Where are they? Of course, we thought you'd been kidnapped. Then the police found out that your tickets had been bought in New York by the FBI. And after that, everyone wanted answers from me." He reached across for one of Bond's cigarettes. "Now, tell me your story." Bond told him. "Did anyone see you when you left the train at Jacksonville?" asked Leiter. "I don't think so," said Bond. "But we'd better keep Solitaire here until we can get her safely away. We'll put her on a flight to Jamaica tomorrow. I can get someone to look after her there until we come." "Okay," said Leiter. "We'll get a ticket for her to fly to Miami tomorrow. From there she can fly to Jamaica. She should arrive in Jamaica by tomorrow evening." "Is that okay, Solitaire?" asked Bond. Solitaire was staring out of the window. "Yes," she said nervously. "Yes, I suppose that's all right."